Welcome to the second of our Invest for Success masterclasses, buying off the plan. But there's no denying there's an absolute crisis going on for supply of housing in Australia. We looked at specifically Brisbane last month, and this was a graph that was supplied to us by Urbis. And you can see there the green bars really show the supply that has come on over the last few years. You can see in 2020, 2021, and 2022, the green bars there, there's very, very little supply that's come to market. The blue lines and the purple lines that you can see, and even the pink lines, are pretty much projects that are in the pipeline at various different stages. Now, one of the big things that came out of that presentation was that there's some real constraints or some real challenges for developers bringing things to market at the moment, certainly in terms of material costs and supply of materials, and also in labour costs and supply as well. So there's some real constraints there, which means that a lot of these projects, a lot of the blues and the purples and the pinks that you see there, may not even materialise into green bars. So we believe that for the next 3, 4, 5 years, possibly, we're going to continue to have a real supply issue, certainly here in Brisbane, certainly in southeast Queensland, and certainly in other areas around the country. So for a lot of our clients and a lot of the inquiries that we've been getting, people have been asking more and more about buying off the plan because they're being simply forced to. It's very difficult to find very good stock out there without looking at off the plan. So it's become very, very topical at the moment, and it's the reason why we wanted to talk about this tonight. The other reason, of course, too, is that there's some real advantages in buying off the plan. There's some real advantages. Now, a lot of those are often overshadowed by a lot of the risks that go along with it. And for a lot of people, it's simply been too much risk. I'm not going down that path. But tonight we're going to talk about those risks and go into some detail and how you go about mitigating a lot of those risks. It may not still be appropriate for you and your circumstances and your risk appetite, but they're the things that we're really going to drill down on tonight to get to some of those risks. And we'll start with the advantages first and talk about the risks of buying off the plan. So they're the two reasons we chose this as a topic tonight.
So normally, if you think of it in terms of a funnel, you know, the DA side, pre-DA and land acquisition, the neck of the funnel is pretty wide. As you go down the path through DA, through contracting, through pre-sales, through financing, through all of the other things, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And what the end product looks like is getting more and more certain. And the general requirement in Queensland is that once you go through the process of disclosure with a buyer and signing a contract, if there's a material change, as soon as the developer knows about it, they have to tell the buyer, and the buyer gets a chance to have another look at it.
Often they will have a pre-sale requirement from the bank. So it could be anything from 20% of sales. Let's say it's a townhouse development. They may say, we want you to get contracts on 20% of them before we actually promise to give you the money to complete the construction.
Correct? And then down the line, usually the funding requirements will be linked into quantity surveyors reports, how things are being built and constructed. So usually for a developer to get off the ground and get the money, the bank needs to be satisfied that the project makes sense, the costing has all been done and it's feasible, the developer has enough skin in the game in terms of its own money on the line, and that at the end of the day, the bank believes that the deal is going to go through and be completed.
And that's a really interesting point, because we will come back to that a little bit later when talking about some of those risks. The big advantage for buying off the plan is that certainly in rising markets, you are able to lock in or sign a contract at today's price. And if markets continue to rise, so long as it's priced effectively or fairly in the beginning and not, put a premium put on top of it because there's 2 years to go for the development. But if it's priced fairly and markets do continue to rise, then of course you are the beneficiary of doing that. So you might not have had to put a lot of money down to hold that opportunity. Locking in a price is one thing, discounted price for pre-sales. We talked about pre-sales, and obviously developers are pretty keen to get sales because they've invested a lot by that that stage, and they're pretty much on the hook for losing a lot of money. So they want to get the funding from the lender, so they've got to get their pre-sales requirement. Often developers will give a discounted pricing in that stage because they're really keen to get that first 20% of units or townhouses or house and land packages off the ground and up and running, so they can lock in the funding for the rest of their project and get on with completion.
Real choices a lot of people have is they can either go and acquire some existing land and stock. Well, that's got its own limitations. They can go and acquire a new block of land and build a house. Well, that's got a whole heap of other issues. The other one is if you go through this process and talking about a lot of the things that I mentioned before with development approvals and the consultants are all involved, usually the majority of the time there's a greater leverage off everyone working together. And that means that the product that's delivered at the end of the day should usually have a better standard. It will have better facilities, better options, better fit outs, better requirements, because ultimately you're not going and buying one roof, you're buying a roof for 30 units. Or alternatively, you're not just putting in one pool, you're putting in a pool for 30 people, which means the amount of money that can get spent on some of the services is a lot better. Aside from that, you can also end up with a lot better amenity in some developments if they're done properly. There's been a rise in Queensland, definitely in my time, of doing mixed-use developments, which are developments that have retail or commercial on ground floors or other parts of developments, and then they have residential up the top. And that also means there's more money in the mix for people to do more with it. And it could also bring, cafes, services, things that people otherwise wouldn't have if they're out in suburbia or in other areas.
If you're buying into a unit development, it's usually the case that the top ones sell first. Everyone wants to rent the top ones when they go in, or the very bottom ones are often, people with pets like ground floor apartments. So they're typically all the ones that go first. And often when you get in early, you have that sort of selection. You can also often customize if you get in early enough. And that can be anything from moving around walls and changing all the inclusions to just simply getting a choice of a dark scheme or a light scheme, depending again on the developments. For a lot of people, buying off the plan simply gives them more time to save or to plan. And that is particularly true when it comes to investors. We have a lot of investors that are thinking about their next move. And if they can take into consideration a lot of those variables, then they can think about getting their next one earlier and making sure they've got all of those things, locking in that price, getting the best of the best in terms of what project they get into and what product within that project that they get into as well. When you sign a contract on buying off the plan, it typically will not have a finance clause. And even if it did have a finance clause or wouldn't be subject to finance, even if it was, banks generally only hold a pre-approval to up to about 3 months. So if you're buying something that's 18 months, 2 years off the plan, and your finances are fantastic today, but something happens to you down the track and you lose your job, or you go through, maybe there's a death in the family or divorce or any of those things, you may find yourself in a position where you can't actually settle on that property. And most developers will require 10% down for them to hold. In fact, it's not their requirement, it's usually their bank's requirement that says they must have 10% from each purchaser. Now, this is probably the biggest risk for most people. At National Property Advisory, we have for our members, we have what we call an off-the-plan guarantee, where we actually guarantee if that happens, if for no fault of your own, you cannot settle, you may be absolutely fine by today's standards, but interest rates might go up another 5% and it throws you out of the qualification for the bank, and they're no longer prepared to give you the money 18 months down the track. If that happens through no fault of your own, NPA will guarantee that you get your money back and the contract is rescinded. Now, of course, there's some terms and conditions with that, which we can talk to you about individually, but I think it's something that is a real value proposition for a lot of purchasers, a lot of investors that are trying to plan out the next 5 years of what they do with their life with some sort of certainty.
The law in Queensland requires disclosure it requires disclosure on certain things. It doesn't require disclosure on everything. So being aware of the latitude that a developer has under a contract means that you can be aware of what things may change. And a lot of the time, in a lot of the dealings that we have with purchasers, we will go back to the developers and get things tidied up so that variations can't happen to a certain degree. You need to understand that part of the process for the developer is giving themselves enough time to get it done, giving themselves enough time to find funding to get it done, and being able to deliver it properly. So at the end of the day, with the sunset clauses, they can be used as a way to be reasonable about the timing, but I have also seen them in the past be used as a way to renegotiate deals. And that can be pretty horrendous, and that's not what they're there for. There are particular contracts that float around in Queensland which have things that are kind of sunset dates but not. They'll have an end date for construction, but then they'll have timings for other things which are really sunset dates for the developer. So they can have clauses that say it's subject to the developer getting a certain number of pre-sales by a certain date. Well, the developer can kill the deal. It can be subject to them getting approvals by a certain date. Well, again, developer can kill the deal. But basically speaking, the only right a buyer will have is if that final sunset date isn't hit, well, then they can walk away from it. So,
yeah, but it doesn't always go that way. I've actually seen somebody that has asked for their sunset clause to be reduced, and because they really wanted the option to be able to get out if the developer didn't finish by a particular stage. In this particular case, it was only about 1 month after that termination clause came through. The property had gone up $300,000 in that time. The developer terminated the contract because they were legally able to do so, and just resold it for $300,000 more. So you've got to be very careful with those things. I think good advice in this area is really, really important. I've even seen split sunset clauses where the developer basically gets all the upside and none of the downside. So you really need somebody to be able to understand these things and how they work and how they may affect you.
A lot of the older agreements didn't have a lot of latitude for builders, and nowadays there is a lot more. Generally speaking, if I don't see an agreement that has a COVID clause in it, I wonder why not. But the COVID clauses can even be a little bit unfair, and people have got to be careful, because those clauses that give developers complete latitude and complete get out of jails, they can in some cases they can make the contract uncertain and unenforceable. So again, knowing what the rights of the builder are and knowing where the get out of jails are for the builder is important. But on the flip side, from a buyer's point of view, at the end of the day, if they want the lot, they need to make sure the contract is going to stitch up. And that means that the developer can't just have unilateral rights to change things, can't have unilateral rights to blow out dates. And you need to be going back to that concept of, if they want more time or they need rights to get out, it needs to be fair to both parties, because the last thing a buyer wants is to sign a contract today expecting completion in 3 years, and 2 years and 6 months away the developer says, nah, thanks, I'm not interested, here's your money back.
Things on there. We have our own due diligence process, which looks right into a whole range of services, everything from reconciling the renters with the inclusions list, really drilling down to be able to say to clients, hey, this is how this is going to look. This one won't look like that. That's just a pretty picture for the brochure. But really knowing what you're going to get. I think also with that is that you can end up with some ownership issues as well, and that's another thing. For those people buying new, often they're buying new because they want all the negative gearing benefits of the depreciation to be able to claim back and all that sort of thing. I've actually seen it where developers have finished a project, holding on to a few units or apartments or whatever in that development. They decide to switch those into a different entity for tax purposes, and then that triggers a subsequent property ownership rule where the owner, even though they're buying it off the developer, is unable to claim for depreciation on the fixtures and fittings of that, and that's a significant cash flow effect to that purchase, to that investor. So there are all sorts of things that can happen there. Again, a due diligence process is very important when it comes.
But the main difference between an off-plan development for a community title scheme and a house and land development would be probably what I spoke about before in terms of how many consultants and people there are involved in the mix. One of probably, I think, the best advantages of off-plan community titling is that you have all of those consultants involved, and the main one will be a project manager. in all good developments, there'll be a project manager who is there to make sure the consultants are doing what they need to do, the builder's doing what they need to do, and things are going forward properly. If you're buying your own block of land and getting your own builder involved, that's on you. And unless you understand the process, unless you are going to go and get a building contract reviewed, which can be pretty scary, it's on you, as is the funding. And one of the main issues that I've seen in the past with house and land packages or house contracts is when the funding agreements with the bank don't line up with the construction contract, and a builder has their hand out saying, pay me, and the bank is saying no. That is a big problem.
Yeah, that's a massive problem. But even simple things like being subject to soil tests and all of those sorts of things, it's very difficult to get a fixed price on a construction of a house at the moment.
And look, I would say at the moment the chance of going into a fixed price contract on a house are zero. We do a fair few, and I have not seen one in the last few months. They have all been cost plus. And a cost plus contract is probably one of the scariest things you can ever see, because it's the cost plus, it doesn't matter. And
again, just something to be aware of if that's the product type that you are choosing. There's no right or wrong with any of this stuff. It's just being aware of the risks and some mitigation strategies. We're not going to share all of the mitigation strategies with you tonight. We have to leave something up our sleeve, of course. Otherwise, you don't need us. But certainly there are things to think about when going down these paths if you're going to buy off the plan. I think it's just good to know that there is that provision there. So if something, I think sometimes people not knowing about buying off the plan, they have this kind of concept of what could happen. There is a scope of what can happen, and there are some protections for the consumer, so natural contract protections.
And the Queensland government is pretty solid on that. I mean, the material changes in disclosure statements is one example. The unfair contracts term is another. The government doesn't want people getting stung for things that aren't fair.
Regulations of when we go down to engineering plans and all of those things, there's some very strict guidelines of how to build a property, and obviously all of those things have to be adhered to. I think it's fair to say that they've got a lot stricter over the last year, particularly since the warranty scheme came in. When was that, about 13 years ago or something like 13, 14 years ago?
Quite some years ago, the concept of appointing caretaking and letting agents came about, where the body corporate would sign off on a long-term agreement with a particular provider to undertake caretaking services. So instead of having to get Jim's mowing in to cut the grass, the caretaker would take care of it. Instead of having to get a separate contractor in to take care of the pool, another contractor would take care of it. So there is some real value add in that. But the other side of it is you need to make sure it's fair. There are obligations under Queensland law that if any of those agreements are being granted by a developer, they need to be reasonable. And if they're not, there's some comeuppance. But realistically, the way you determine whether or not those caretaking lead agreements are fair is part of the disclosure requirement is the budget of the body corporate, and there's a line item for the caretaking letting fee. So you can see through there.
The channel market is where a lot of developers actually distribute off the plan properties through channels. It could be accountants, it could be solicitors, financial planners, property agents like ourselves, and they often don't hit the general market, and a lot of general real estate agents aren't really interested because a lot of their clients are owner occupiers, and they won't look at buying off the plan because a lot of them like to look through the property and place the furniture rather than just buying off a plan. So having access to those channels often gives you a lot of access to stuff that you might not have access to. The other advantage of that is that we really are able to drill down on the reputation and the financial position and all of those things that you as a consumer may not necessarily be able to do. So channel market is a great tool for us in mitigating some of those risks. Next question, is going through an advisor going to be too expensive, and am I better off doing it myself? Can you please explain the return on investment, the ROI? So look, my view on that is the same with everything. There's lots of things that I'm not very good at, and I believe in the outsourced story. When it comes to professional services, and I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, I can safely say that it's not the difference that we make at the margin getting you, the best property in the world or the second best property. It's not at that margin that we really make a difference. Where we really make a difference is by stopping people making mistakes. That's where the rubber hits the road. And that's where it can be absolutely devastating for people, and they may never go to another investment property themselves, and consequently have a very different retirement for themselves. So I think personally, the few dollars that you pay tends to look like this in the scheme of what you should be making over the long term. And all of those professional advice fees and the insurances and all of those things, they're just the cost of doing business for a professional investor, or even somebody who is considering an owner-occupied residence. If you're going to go off the plan, I think Niall's made a pretty good point tonight that there's lots to be considered when going down this path. And professionals, it's like anything. You can go to Dr. Google, or you can go to a real doctor. I'm an absolute believer in professional service.
Look, I think one of the main issues that I have in my industry is that legal services are seen as a grudge purchase. And there's a lot of training that I put into my clients and the people I know and the referrers that I have about don't ask me too late. And, you are better off to know the answer now. There is a genuine return on investment for people in getting good advice right at the start.
Next question, does NPA work with first home buyers? We certainly do. And everyone still has different strategies. Again, it might feel very simple. I just want to buy my first house. Well, there's actually a whole lot of things that come to that. For how long? Why? What's the purpose? Is it just to live in? Can you compromise on the living for a better investment return? There's all sorts of things that go into that. So it's still a big part of building a strategy for somebody, and we definitely work with those people. And all of the due diligence and the research and all of that goes with it. So we definitely work with first home buyers. I think that's it for now, and we've pretty much run out of time. In fact, we've gone over time because you're so interesting, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
It wouldn't be a conversation with me if it didn't go over
time. Enjoy that bottle of scotch I got you for attending. It's delicious.
It's been great, and look, I love helping people with anything. So it's always good to be able to express some opinions and give some people some knowledge.
JHK have been absolutely fantastic, not only from the service level for our clients over the years, but also in providing really good value for money in what they do. So I know he sounds expensive because he's really intelligent, but I would say not cheap, but very good value for money. So we can help you with that and all of the other components that you'll need in putting a property strategy together. So we'd love to help you. Hope you enjoyed this evening, and from there we'll say good night.
Good night.